So, welcome back everyone to Climate Conversations. My name is Jabin.
My name is Jamelia.
And my name is Siyan.
And here on our show, Climate Conversations, we discuss and learn topics based on environmental and climate-related issues and changes, spreading the word on how to make the world a better place. Today, we will be speaking to Graeme about Tridel's environmental protocols and plans. Graeme, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Graeme Armster, Tridel's Director of Innovation and Sustainability, and just happy to be here.
So what do you do? What would you say is Tridel?
So Tridel is, we like to think of ourselves as a community builder, and we build housing for people, and through that, we like to set up, we like to build quality housing for people, and then on top of that, we like to set up as part of the housing and make sure that all the necessary needs for the community are in place, so that as the community starts to develop and build and flourishes, we can help support the community so that ultimately it's set up to deliver success.
Great. So what's your role at Tridel?
So my role is more focused on innovation and sustainability, looking at ways for which we can build better developments that reduce energy consumption, developments that through technology improve the overall experience and living for its residents, and then as well, ultimately, like most developers these days, we're looking to reduce and ultimately get to a point where we're producing zero emissions.
So what are some of your strategies for meeting the zero emission protocol?
So it's a good question. So we've thought about this extensively, and really to focus our attention on the goal at hand, we've kind of narrowed it down into 6 key areas of focus. So the first one is air tightness, and delivering a high-performing airtight building. The next is just looking at the building and materials along the envelope to reduce energy loss through the envelope. As well, a new term that's been coming up in the industry that people are starting to understand more is embodied carbon, how we can reduce overall embodied carbon within construction and the buildings that we build. As well, looking at benchmarking. So we're in an area where data is a useful tool, and if we can gather that data and learn from the past, we can improve on the future. After that, we're also looking at renewable energy, so really keeping our hands or our eyes open in the industry in terms of all the different technologies that seem to be coming out. And then lastly, the last thing is just looking at gaps in the industry and helping advise the government on areas where we can improve altogether. Did you want me to jump into maybe a bit more detail each one of those items, or?
Yeah, I was gonna quickly ask you what embodied carbon is for those who might not know what it is.
Okay, sure. So right now, some of the data that's been published out there is, buildings in total contribute to about 40% of the world's emissions. So within that 40%, there's a good chunk of it which is generated just in erecting or constructing these buildings. So right now, because energy is not 100% clean everywhere, and even the processes that we put in place to mine a material, maybe it's a material we mine that we then ship to a factory where it gets processed maybe into glass. Then from the factory where it's processed, it gets shipped to site, and then on site it gets erected. That whole process results in an emissions footprint. And then lastly, it goes even further, and we look at the life cycle of that material, typically 60 years, and what it means if that piece of glass maybe has to be replaced once or twice in that 60-year span, and then from A to Z, the emissions associated with producing that. Now, of the 40% of building emissions, 11% of that, around 11% of that, is embodied carbon emissions. And especially in a city like Toronto, where there's tons of construction activity, embodied carbon emissions could play a big role in our contribution to the environment.
Great. So, are there like any environmental policies that Tridel will be following, like such as LEEDs or like the Toronto Green Standard?
Yeah. So Toronto, along with other municipalities like Vancouver, are definitely leaders in Canada in terms of the guidance and standards they have in place, or codes they have in place to help guide developers in producing, sustainable, environmentally friendly, and high-performing buildings. So TGS kind of has its roadway mapped out to reduce carbon emissions by 2028. So all new developments will have to be near zero carbon emissions, which basically means the buildings will have to be electrified. A small portion of emissions will still be generated, just because although Ontario's grid is quite clean, it still has a percentage of electricity that's generated through combustion of natural gas. So emissions are generated there. So that's kind of the starting point. But then to your point, layered on top of TGS, there's good standards like LEED, which Tridel has, been a big participant in the past. We've continued to evaluate LEED in line with TGS to make sure that, it's still forcing us and the industry in the right direction. LEED is actually facilitated by the Canadian Green Building Council, who recently came out with a new standard called the Zero Carbon Standard, which is quite interesting. So Tridel's been looking at that, and in terms of what we do now, and even what we're planning on doing at Regent Park, we will look to the Zero Carbon Standard as for inspiration on good decisions we can make on the operational side of carbon, which is pretty straightforward, but then also on the embodied side of carbon, which I talked about before. So that's another standard that we'll be looking at, as well as another good standard is Passive House, which I know TCH has been looking at for some of their past work they've done. We'll also look at Passive House for inspiration to improve things. I think I said at the beginning of the conversation, one of our spotlights that we're focusing on is air tightness. Well, Passive House is a very good standard that helps provide guidance on developers really improving air tightness, which if we improve air tightness will ultimately drastically decrease energy consumption in buildings and have a direct impact on emissions. So that's another standard we'll look at. And then the city also has good bylaws that they put in place. They removed minimum parking requirements, so we'll force developers and the community to get creative maybe on how what facilities we incorporate in our developments on parking. Ultimately, to reduce emissions, or alternatively, if we do have parking, focus it more on low carbon transportation like electric vehicles, as well, with a focus on maybe public transportation and things like that. And the last one is just Toronto is one of the greener cities in the world in terms of landscape. We're blessed to have a lot of parks and tree coverage and things like that. So leveraging the city's guidance on the green roof requirements and how much trees we have on our sites are other things that we'll look to when we look to plan Regent Park.
So I know we already touched on this, but what's Tridel's biggest environment goal?
I think for us the biggest environment goal is hitting ultimately eventually zero emissions, just across the board. Not only in terms of the developments we build. Again, when people hear zero emissions, they automatically think, you're not burning any more gas. But I think looking beyond that, and even looking at the term I talked about before, embodied carbon, to make sure that ultimately on the embodied carbon side, we get to a point where we're reducing our footprint when we look to build buildings. So I think that's the ultimate goal. And then on top of that, I think the other way that people look at emissions is you may have heard the term scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3. So for Tridel, scope 3 emissions are emissions that we don't have a direct influence on, but we can indirectly influence. So that embodied carbon would fall under that. Or for our new developments, the buildings that we build, if we put gas in them, we don't control how much gas people burn, because it's dependent on maybe, you know, how they set their thermostats or how much hot water they use. But just by the indirect decision of us deciding to put gas into a building, we've kind of influenced the fact that people are going to burn gas. So if we can control those scope 3 decisions, so that, you know, the buildings we pass on to people, they have an opportunity to minimize their emissions, that's one part of it. And then scope 1 and scope 2 are really driven around our direct decisions. So it would be at Tridel's head office, you know, maybe we ultimately phase out heating our head office with gas, and look at more renewable solutions. So things like that are basically decisions that we'll want to make as we start to progress into a world where we hit our ultimate goal of you know, helping our Earth and reducing our impact from an emissions standpoint.
So how will you analyze to see if you have met these goals?
So it's a good question. So right now we're you know, Tridel's a great company from the standpoint that you know, sustainability has been at its core since the early 2000s, when they were one of the first few developers who decided to adopt LEED as part of its building practices, and continue on developing that all the way through to now. So you know, that's been a great thing. Tridel is a great CSR platform where we, you know, communicate all of the great things that we're trying to do to not only improve community, but improve the world from a sustainability standpoint and minimize our impact on the world. So we're in the process right now of reevaluating that, and ultimately looking to further build on that and start to come up with some clear targets. So I think the simple one is by 2028, we want to be building near zero emissions buildings. The reason I say near zero and not zero is because ultimately, again, we can only control as a developer what we can control in the plot of land that we're developing. Meaning, again, we can fully electrify this building, but because Ontario's grid is not 100% clean just yet, you know, we don't have a say on how the province produces power. We can lobby and you know, provide guidance to the industry to help us get there, but until the grid's clean, we won't be able to be fully at zero. So that's why, you know, our goal right now is let's electrify, let's get to a point where we're near zero, and then when we're near zero, at least that development, when we've left it and the building's operating, the building doesn't have to sink any more money into it to decarbonize. It's really a function of the government when they eventually, you know, work with the local utility to decarbonize the grid. Naturally, that building will just now become decarbonized. So one is, you know, we're going to continue to measure our emissions that we, you know, imprint on the environment now and into the future, so that we can basically validate that, hey, we're on target, and then eventually when we do get to a point where we're near zero, we'll be able to, you know, through third-party auditing and all that, say, hey, look, we've gotten to near zero as well. So I think if I go back to when we first started, you know, what are some of the core areas that Tridel's focusing on? There were 6 items that I think I mentioned. So and they all kind of feed into us getting to our goal of zero emissions. But if I expand those further, the other one is air tightness. So right now, the City of Toronto and the Toronto Green Standard has air tightness as a requirement that's not mandatory, but, you know, they're recommending developers start doing that. So that's on our radar, and we've started to do some pilots with some new technologies that can really improve the air tightness in buildings. So we are measuring, you know, what our buildings are doing today, ultimately with the goal of where we want to get our buildings from an air tightness standpoint, and that's to a passive house level. So that was one standard that I mentioned before that we're going to be, using as inspiration. As well, in terms of reducing emissions and getting energy consumption down, we're also looking to improve our building materials and envelope. So to get emissions down, it's helpful if we reduce the amount of energy that we're consuming. So we'll be measuring, how we improve the envelope, and ultimately how that drastically reduces energy consumption, leading to reduced emissions. And then the last thing is just improving or increasing our uptake in renewables. So if we can start outfitting our buildings, which there's some cool companies out there doing some interesting things on the renewables side. In terms of solar, there's buildings that are now doing what they call building integrated photovoltaics. So, your balcony railing that in the past was just a balcony railing, now maybe that has solar panels included on it. So now the building can in turn generate power and reduce emissions. And then also another thing is on the renewable side, geothermal. So we're looking at including more geothermal on our sites, and in talks for Regent Park and RPEI. RPEI is the district energy provider for the site. We're in talks with them to see if we can, look at incorporating geothermal. So those are all things that we can measure, ultimately with the angle of measuring zero emissions or near zero, by 2028 timeframe for all new developments.
Great. And we know that the climate crisis is a really big thing that people are talking about. So how exactly does Tridel's technology that they're going to implement in the building mitigate the crisis that we're going through right now?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think the ultimate thing is, what's causing this. I think science has been pretty clear that our Earth is warming as a result of the emissions that we're, injecting into the atmosphere. I think I read a book recently that said, if we're going to meet the Paris Climate Accord requirements, we basically have to half our emissions every 10 years for the next 10 years or next 30 years up until 2050. So we got a lot of work to do, and I think Tridel's contribution to that will be, going back to what I said before, ultimately if we can capture our scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions and get them down, to a point where we ultimately deliver on a near zero or zero emissions performance, I think that would be the first part. And then ultimately on top of that, because, Tridel can only contribute what's within their bucket, which is, what we build and our operations and getting emissions down that way. There's other things we can do to also protect the developments, the communities, the sites. And I think another big item that's coming up more recently is resiliency, right? Climate resiliency. So if there's things we can do in our developments, one thing Tridel recently did was we put a resilient space in all of our buildings now. So we actually ensure that there's a room in the building that's backed up on emergency power, has air conditioning, heating, water, lighting, connectivity, all of the things you would need, refrigeration, so if people need to restore or store medication, all the things you would need in the event if there was a power outage, people could ultimately stay in their building. So that's another aspect that we're doing, as well as with warming, looking at the climate conditions outside the building, so that even though it's getting hotter, maybe the site's designed in such a way that it's more comfortable for people. So maybe less concrete, more greenery, thoughtful design so that you don't have wind tunnel style conditions, all of those things. So really, in terms of Tridel looking at climate initiatives, it's what can we do to reduce our impact, but then also how can we be more resilient at the same time.
Do you think there's anything else that has been covered in this interview?
No, I think that's basically everything. I mean, ultimately, all I can say is that the end goal for Tridel is just to get emissions down and limit the impact that we have on the environment, and do our part. That's really it.
All right, that was a great conversation. I hope our viewers learned a lot about Tridel's environmental policies. Thank you, Graeme, for joining us to touch upon these topics. And that was all for our show today. Hope to see you guys again on Climate Conversations.
Thank you.
Bye.
Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And when you do subscribe, hit the little notification bell so you never miss out on any of our content. If you'd also like more, you can find us on our other social media platforms. And if you want even more, you can look at our website.